Atlanta has always been dressed in glass and polish, and my family's name fits neatly into that reflection. Voss and Hale Hotels, founded on my grandfather's vision, is whispered at charity galas, splashed across glossy magazines, and etched onto lobbies that smell faintly of citrus and wealth. To the city. We are a dynasty. To me. We are a portrait so carefully staged that no one notices the cracks. Those cracks were clearest at home. My brother Lachlan had a spotlight that never dimmed. When he failed out of his first year at college, he was rewarded with a leased BMW. When I graduated with honors in finance, the most I received was a distracted nod at every board dinner. Lachlan was the future of the company. I was the afterthought, the one expected to stay polite, applaud, and not ask for a seat at the table. The only person who refused to play along was August, my grandfather. He had made his fortune as an investment banker long before hotels became our family's crown jewel. To him, wealth was never proof of worth character was. Over late-night coffee. He reminded me that he built this empire with integrity and discipline, not shortcuts or favorites. He believed I inherited that discipline, even when my parents made me feel invisible. It was August who first taught me never to hand trust over blindly. Years ago, after an accounting mix-up quietly drained one of my accounts, I learned my lesson. I created a structure of protection's dual accounts, automated alerts, and one last safeguard, a decoy safe code. If anyone ever pressed me for money under the guise of an emergency, they would reach only the surface, never the foundation. It wasn't cynicism that made me prepare. It was survival, growing inside a house where love was conditional and trust was currency. And I carried that preparation with me as I stepped toward the first real opportunity of my career, ready to finally prove I didn't need their stage to shine. The morning light in Atlanta carried a different weight that day. For once, it wasn't filtered through the shadow of my family's expectations. I was packing for Chicago, rehearsing the cadence of my pitch in my head, the slides etched into my memory after weeks of work. It wasn't just another client meeting, it was the kind of opportunity that could push my career into its own orbit, separate from the Voss name. I ran through the numbers again in the cab to the airport, tapping notes into my phone, careful not to let nerves disguise themselves as doubt. I had earned this pitch through long hours, referrals I chased myself, and a reputation I built without leaning on the hotel empire. For the first time, the success or failure of something this important rested entirely on me. That thought steadied me more than it shook me. Before leaving, my father had appeared at the doorway to my apartment, arms crossed, voice sharp with that familiar edge. "Don't embarrass the Voss name," he said, as if my work would reflect more on him than on me. I didn't answer. Instead, I picked up my suitcase and walked past him, leaving his words to hang in the stale air like smoke I refused to breathe. On the way through security, I texted August boarding soon. "Wish me luck." A minute later, his reply flashed back. "You don't need luck. You're ready." Julia sent her own message. "Remember, no matter what he says, you don't owe Graham a thing." Their voices steadied me. Two lifelines reminding me that not everyone in my bloodline doubted me. When the boarding call echoed overhead, I felt a flicker of freedom. This trip wasn't just business, it was proof I could live outside their shadow. I slung my bag over my shoulder and walked toward the gate, unaware that one phone call would unravel everything I thought I'd secured. I was seated at the gate, laptop open, rehearsing my opening line one last time when my phone lit up with my father's name. I almost ignored it. Graham never called me unless there was a reason to unsettle me. But the vibration rattled against the chair. Insistent. I answered. His voice came through fractured, heavy with a tremor I had never heard before. "Callista, it's your grandfather. He's badly hurt. A fall. We need money for treatment. It's urgent." The words lodged in my chest. August was the one person in this family I couldn't imagine losing. I shot to my feet, the boarding call muffled by the thundering in my ears. "Where is he?" I demanded. "We're at the hospital," he said quickly, breath shallow. "They need payment before they'll do the scans." "Send it now." "Callista, don't think, just do it." In the past, I might have faltered, desperate to prove I was useful. Now, every instinct warred with the memory of late-night talks with August. Still, the panic overrode my suspicion. I opened my banking app, thumb hovering. Graham pressed harder. "You're safe, give me the code. Now." The old reflex clicked into place. I gave him the code I had built for exactly this moment, the decoy, the one that unlocked a separate account seeded with enough to appear real. 7 figures moved instantly into a quarantined pool, every dollar tagged with trace flags and alerts that pinged Julia the moment they left. I canceled my flight, the email to my client drafted with shaking fingers, then drove straight toward Buckhead, the city skyline blurring past. My stomach churned, my heart torn between fear and a rising unease. When I pulled into August's driveway, my hands still clutched the wheel tight. And then the front door opened, and there he was, upright, calm, and holding the morning paper. August stood in the doorway, his reading glasses balanced low on his nose, the morning paper tucked under his arm. The sight of him so steady made my knees weaken. I nearly collapsed into his arms, but the confusion on his face stopped me cold. "Callista, what on earth are you doing here? Shouldn't you be in Chicago?" The words hit harder than a slap. My throat closed as I tried to explain. "Dad called. He said you'd fallen, that you were hurt, maybe dying." His eyes darkened. He stepped back and motioned me inside. Once the door closed behind us, he rubbed at his temples, heavy with the weight of something he hadn't wanted to say. He asked me to play along. August admitted, said it would keep things peaceful if you stayed out of the way for a while. I told him no. I wouldn't lie to you. I sank into his armchair, the same one I'd curled into as a child when he told me stories about discipline and fairness. My chest burned with betrayal. He hadn't just manipulated me, he had tried to weaponize the one bond in this family that was still unbroken. I opened my laptop, fingers steady despite the shaking in my heart. On the dashboard, red alerts blinked across the screen. The decoy funds were already moving, funneled out in neat transfers to accounts that stank of shell companies and laundering routes. August leaned over my shoulder. He thinks he won. I closed the laptop with a snap. No. He thinks I'm still the girl who would cry and beg for scraps. Not anymore. The fear I'd carried since that call didn't dissolve, it crystallized into something sharper. I would not waste another tear. If Graham wanted to steal, then every wire he touched would become a record. I straightened, staring across the study's shelves of old ledgers and contracts, already forming a plan. The wound was a lie. My weapon would be the truth. I spent the next hour at August's desk, screens glowing across the room like floodlights in the dark. Every transaction appeared in real time, the alerts cascading in neat succession. Outflows from the decoy account spread like cracks in glass, first to a maintenance vendor tied to the hotels, then to a consultancy address in the Caribbean I recognized as nothing more than a rented post office box. From the outside, anyone reviewing those lines would see the story of Panic's $7 million drained in a matter of hours. I leaned back, forcing my shoulders to slump, rehearsing what grief would look like if Graham or anyone else came sniffing. But the truth was different. Each loss carried its own tag. Every wire traced and mirrored into a file I had been building for years. Julia's notifications were already firing. She would know exactly where to push, which regulators to nudge. August sat across from me, watching carefully. "He's always thought you were too quiet to see what he was doing," he murmured. "He doesn't understand you've been listening longer than he's been talking." I smiled without humor. "He thinks he emptied me out. All he really did was open a paper trail I couldn't have bought myself. The alerts kept stacking KYC matches against dormant corporations. shell structures too sloppy to survive a single audit. It was almost insulting how careless he had become. Convinced of his own invincibility, I cataloged every detail, screenshot after screenshot, each one a weapon stored neatly in its folder. Publicly, I would wear devastation. If Graham expected a broken daughter, then that was the mask I would give him. Privately, every wire he touched became a confession signed in numbers. August poured us both coffee, his hands steady where mine burned with restless energy. "You'll have to decide how far you're willing to take this," he said. I stared at the screen. The final transfer flashing across the last of the 7 million moved into another hollow company, vanishing on paper. I exhaled slowly, almost laughing at the predictability of it all. From the outside, I had just lost everything. From the inside, I had never been more ready. August watched me, puzzled, as I pressed the heel of my hand against my mouth to stifle the laugh threatening to break free. It wasn't amusement. It was relief, the kind that came when a plan years in the making finally snapped into place. "Why are you smiling?" he asked. His brows pulled tight. I turned the laptop toward him, showing him the flagged reports blinking red. "Because he didn't take $7 million, I said quietly. "He stole a tripwire." The memory hit me as clearly as if it were yesterday I was 22, working my first real job when Graham called late at night, insisting he needed immediate access to one of my accounts. He called it a family emergency, his voice syrupy, persuasive, but his tone carried the same entitlement it always had. I gave him what he asked for then, and I watched half my savings evaporate into expenses I never authorized. That was the night I promised myself it would never happen again. From that moment, I began building safeguards and LLC in my name that legally owned the true reserves, accounts layered with insurance, mirrored reporting, and pre-drafted subpoenas that would auto-queue if certain thresholds were crossed. The decoy pool was theater, stocked with just enough to look convincing, designed to bleed if ever forced open. Now the alerts I had engineered were in motion, sending data trails to secure archives. Julia called within the hour, her voice sharpened with purpose. "I've already begun filings," she said. "Injunction drafts, suspicious activity reports, preservation letters to the banks. By tomorrow morning, regulators will have packets on their desks." August leaned back, a rare smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "So he thinks he's won?" "No," I corrected. Closing the laptop, "He thinks he's clever. What he doesn't realize is that he just gave me everything I need to bring him down." I poured fresh coffee, my hand steady now. The fear replaced with clarity. The trap was set, and all I had to do was wait for it to close. The next morning, August brought down boxes from his attic, dust rising in the air as though the past itself resisted being disturbed. Inside were decades of ledgers, contracts, and hand-scribbled notes that predated Graham's takeover. Julia arrived with her laptop and legal pads, ready to comb through every number, together. We spread the evidence across August's study until the floor was carpeted with years of transactions. The patterns surfaced quickly. Invoices from routine maintenance were inflated threefold. Lease agreements for partnered restaurants tied back to shell companies registered under Laughlin's name. Even the hotel's corporate wellness program routed funds through an advisory group that existed only on paper. It wasn't just sloppy accounting, it was a pipeline. And every drop flowed straight toward Laughlin. I traced the wires on my screen, following one transaction into another. The path lit up like a web of deceit. Each transfer was small enough to blend into normal business, but relentless in its consistency. 1,000 here. 10,000 there, until the sum dwarfed what I'd thought was missing. My father hadn't just stolen. He had engineered a system to keep funneling me out of the family's future when Julia uncovered an email thread between Graham and a board consultant. My chest tightened. In it, he dismissed me as optics, not operations. He had carved me down to a face for photographs, a token of diversity in a family portrait he wanted to control. Nothing more. August shook his head as he read. "He's terrified," he said softly. "Terrified of dying with an heir who can't carry the story. So he props up Lachlan, no matter the cost." I assembled every date, every invoice, every quote where my name was diminished. The dossier grew into a narrative no spin could erase. The empire was built on myth, and now the footnotes were ready to burn it. By the time the sun set, the dossier was no longer just a pile of papers on August's study floor. Julia had transformed it into a weapon. She drafted a motion for an emergency temporary restraining order, attaching the flagged transfers from the decoy account, the inflated invoices, and the email threads. With each signature line filled, the weight shifted. What had been rumor and suspicion now carried the force of law. While Julia finalized the filings, I prepared my own strike. My laptop glowed as I typed out a statement, every word measured like currency. I named no one, accused no one directly, but laid out the facts: a fabricated medical emergency used to coerce funds, the subsequent transfers into questionable accounts, and my decision to make the documentation public. Then I added a line I knew would matter most: my commitment to employees, to pay what was owed, and to transparency moving forward. When I pressed post, the effect was immediate. Notifications exploded across my screen. Investors who once returned my father's calls within minutes now stalled, cautious. Employees, some of whom I had never met, began forwarding emails, records of late paychecks, suspicious directives, even personal notes from Graham demanding silence. One message stopped me cold, an anonymous email with a single attachment. It was the office's shredding schedule for the next morning, complete with security logins and timestamps. The whistleblower's subject line was simple: for the good of the company. Julia skimmed it, her eyes narrowing. If they're moving to destroy records, we'll need preservation orders. I'll get the regulators moving tonight. The walls of the hotel empire, once so impenetrable, now carried the faint smell of smoke. My mother finally whispered, "Callista, we only wanted I cut her off. You wanted control. And now it's gone." They didn't move as I gathered the papers and slid them back into my bag. Their stillness was almost eerie, like they were trying to imagine a version of me that would fold again. But that version no longer existed. I walked to the door, the sound of my keys sharp in the quiet, and knew the next time I faced them, it would not be on their terms. Graham looked up, wearing that familiar smile, the one meant to disarm before the blade cut. "Callista," he said smoothly, "you're out of place here. Let me handle this." I stepped forward, placing a folder on his desk. "This is your contract. Dad, the clause August insisted on dishonesty voids your control. And here are the transfers, the kickbacks, the fabricated emergency you used to pry a code from me. Your legacy is already void." His smile faltered. Fury took its place. "You think you can run this company? You're too sentimental for hard business. You'd ruin us to prove a point." Before I could answer, the door opened again. 2 federal agents entered, badges raised, followed by state investigators carrying preservation orders. Julia's filings had reached their mark. Devices were seized, files bagged. Lachlan's face drained of color. "I only signed what he told me," he blurted. "He promised to fix it. I didn't know it would go this far." Graham slammed a fist against the desk. "Coward." Then he turned to me, voice sharp. "I did this for the Empire, for Lachlan. It has to look unbreakable, even if it means breaking you." August stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Legacy without integrity is only rot." The agents led Graham out as the judge's TRO came through, and in the silence that followed, I felt the weight of the Empire shift toward me. Weeks later, the fallout had settled into something sharper than silence. Graham faced charges that would keep him tangled in hearings for years, his reputation shredded faster than the papers he'd tried to hide. Lachlan, cornered by investigators, admitted to the gambling debts that had quietly bled him dry and fueled the shell companies, in exchange for cooperation. He entered treatment a coward's retreat softened by the faintest trace of remorse. The board moved quickly. Graham was stripped of his seat, and under the clause August had protected, the court named me interim CEO. It wasn't a coronation. It was a responsibility, heavy and unglamorous. But mine. The decoy funds cycled back intact. Proof that my preparation had held? I directed them first to pay back wages, then into a scholarship fund for employees' children, naming it after August. One evening, I rehired the night manager my father had dismissed for refusing to falsify occupancy numbers, watching the man shake my hand, relief written across his face. Felt more like victory than any courtroom ruling. That night, I stood on the rooftop of our flagship hotel with the staff gathered around, opening the books for everyone to see. The city stretched out in lights below, and for the first time, the empire looked honest. Later, I sat with August, the skyline flickering behind us. He admitted his deepest mistake had been confusing loyalty with lenience, letting Graham's ambition grow unchecked. Legacy, he said, isn't inherited, it's earned. Over and over, I agreed. Watching the hotel lights burn steady against the night, they weren't props in someone else's performance anymore. They were lamps I intended to keep lit. Every day, on my own terms.